Hi, this is Kerwin of Father Son Galaxy. We are celebrating the upcoming 50th anniversary of Star Wars. From now until May 25th, 2027, we will dedicate special episodes discussing the film's influence on pop culture. National Public Radio, or NPR, was incorporated February 26, 1970, to broadcast news and cultural programming to radio stations all around the United States. NPR got its funding primarily from government grants, but also from dues and donations. But in 1977, NPR faced a crucial time with a reduction in funding and its audience. The organization needed to find a way to boost their ratings, publicity, and donations to stay afloat. Enter Star Wars. We will discuss this with my guests, Maria Jose Tenuto and John Tenuto, co-authors of the book, The Star Wars Radio Dramas, Brian Daley and the Serialization That Saved NPR. Maria Jose Tenuto, a professor of sociology, was named the 2019 Outstanding Illinois Adjunct Faculty Member of the Year by the Illinois Community College Trustees Association. John Tenuto is a retired sociology professor. He was named the 2020 Central Regional Faculty Member of the Year for the United States by the Association of Community College Trustees. He is also featured in the Netflix documentary, The Toys That Made Us. Maria and John are also huge Star Trek fans. They are the authors of the making of the classic films, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. The book, Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, the making of that classic film, is scheduled for release in September. Maria and John, welcome to Father Son Galaxy.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Thank
Hello.
you. It's such a pleasure. Such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much. And I have the book, so let me hold it up. Here it is. All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you so much for this. Congratulations, by the way. I know it came out a couple of years ago, but it was a wonderful read. It was a fast read and it was very informational. So I'm hoping that, I do it justice by talking about the book and why it's an important story for Star Wars fans, especially to know about if they don't already know. So thank you once again.
Thank you.
Sure. Now, there are generations that have not experienced or never heard of a radio drama. So can we start there? Can you tell us what is a radio drama? And at what point in time were they very popular? Talk about their popularity.
Well, sure. Really, the 1930s and 40s was when they were at their peak. There were some in the United States anyway. We'll talk first about the U.S., I guess. But it was 1950s. You still had a few that were lingering on, Life with Luigi, things like that, Um, uh, but by the time you get to the 50s, television has really supplanted radio, and radio becomes primarily for music and sports and news, not so much for radio plays anymore or radio dramas. But they were very big in the 1930s and 40s, especially thinking of that time. A lot of Americans couldn't make it to a big city to see a movie. So a lot of times they'd hear a movie on the radio. They would do truncated 45-minute versions of that, like "It's a Wonderful Life," and have Jimmy Stewart and Donna Reed redo their roles, and it would be a shortened version of it. But it was a way for audiences, rural audiences in particular, to hear great dramas or mysteries or whatever it happened to be through radio. And it was really a tremendous art form because you had to create visuals for people without any visuals, and that changes because of television. Now, the BBC in England never lost that, and the Brits have still to this day are big radio play fans, and you'll see them you'll see even like Doctor Who and so on. They'll take episodes of shows and make them into radio plays. So that's still very common in England. But that, by the time you're talking about the 1970s, radio plays were almost all but gone in the U.S. except for a CBS mystery program and something called Earplay on NPR.
And I mentioned that NPR was facing a financial crisis. Now, how did the idea of creating a Star Wars radio drama come about? And why did NPR believe that this was their answer to increasing their ratings and donations?
Well, Frank Mankiewicz, whose father was Herman Mankiewicz, those who are film fans have seen that name or heard that name, I'm sure. If you like TCM, you see Frank's son hosting Ben Mankiewicz. But Frank had become the president of NPR. He was well versed in both politics and in media, and he was in essence faced with a crisis. And as you mentioned in the introduction, um, NPR's really was not something most Americans really even knew about. To tell you the truth, even by the late 1970s, it had only been around not even 10 years. It was an afterthought, really. National Public Radio. It literally was taped onto using tape onto the congressional record. It was added on by a senator when they created public television. And they said, well, why don't we do public radio also? And that was a kind of Americans' experience with NPR. It was sort of like, oh yeah, there's something, like Sesame Street on the radio. They really weren't even sure what it was that NPR was, except that they had two successes. One was called All Things Considered, and which was a news program, and also Earplay, which was doing some really fine radio dramas. Those had gotten some ratings. So when Frank came in as president, he wanted to do two things. One of them very controversial. He wanted to seek funding external to government grants and really go to the corporate world and try to get corporations to in essence, pay for some of the programming. That created problems because public radio is supposed to be independent, commercial free, and so on. And the other idea was well, what could we do that would be like Earplay? Can we do Earplay 2 in essence? Was the idea. And one of the people who was friends with Mankiewicz, really through his father, was John Houseman, who, of course, was a great actor, the actor studio teacher. He was in, Paper Chase, and most of us know him as the grandpa on Silver Spoons. But John Houseman was part of the group that had produced War of the Worlds back in the 1930s that had caused the panic. From the audience thinking it was real because it was so well done by Orson Welles. But he was one of the producers of that. And so Frank had turned to him and said, well, how can we do this? Can we resurrect radio dramas beyond Earplay? And Houseman said, well, you really need to speak with a man named Richard Toscan, who was at USC, University of Southern California, who had been doing radio plays. There was an NPR affiliate there called KUSC on campus. And sort of the college radio station was an NPR station in essence. And he had been doing some Raymond Chandler and mystery, radio plays, and they were popular. They were very well produced. He believed very much in the importance of sound to create atmosphere rather than narration. And Houseman said, you need to speak with Richard Toscan. If you want to do radio dramas, he's the guy who understands it in the U.S. External to, John Madden, who had been doing Earplay, who was from the BBC, really, had come to the United States to do Earplay. And so that's kind of how Richard Toscan got involved in it. How Star Wars became involved was they were looking for, well, what do you do? How are we going to do this? And the advice that John Houseman gave to Richard Toscan was, well, whatever you're going to do for NPR, create a scandal. So he's thinking of the War of the Worlds. He's thinking of this is how you're going to get the ratings. Do something that is scandalous. And he was thinking of all these different ideas and couldn't think of anything until a former student of his named Joel Rosenweiss came to see him. Now, Joel was the one who came up with the idea of taking Tommy, the classic rock album, and turning it into a rock opera. And he was sort of back at school visiting his old teachers, and Richard Toscan was dean at that time. And Richard Toscan was sharing with him his problem. I need to help NPR here. I'm supposed to come up with some programming idea. I can't think of anything. I need something scandalous. And without missing a beat, Joel said, do Star Wars on the radio, which was audacious because you're taking the most visual film in history and turning it into something where there are no visuals, and a film that has less than 30 minutes of dialogue. It's about 27 minutes of dialogue in the entire film. And yet you're going to do a 13 episode, basically 7 hour version of it without narration. So that was the scandal. And Richard Toscan knew immediately that that was a great idea.
And they use that in the marketing. They said, you may have seen Star Wars, wait until you hear it.
That's very interesting. And Star Wars just came out about 2 years prior to the idea of coming up with this radio drama. So obviously you had to get permission from George Lucas. So when the idea was pitched to him, what was his response?
Oh, he was on board right away because he understood that there would be a whole population of people who, for various reasons, couldn't get to the theater, and he wanted as many people to see or hear or know Star Wars as possible. And so he sold the rights for $1. And we all know, back then having the rights or the license to Star Wars was a license to print money. But he gave them the rights, and then also all of the sound effects, the music, and even marketing was all in that package.
That would produce actually a problem later on. I think part of it was, I think also George was a USC
Mm.
alumni. So he wanted to help his old school. He saw it as an act of philanthropy. I think he was interested in the challenge of it. That's one of the things we got speaking with
Yeah.
Richard Toscan, that he
He
was
grew
kind of
up,
on board. Sound was everything for
yeah.
George, right? And go
And
ahead.
he grew up with the radio dramas. So Flash Gordon, Lone Ranger was on the radio before being a television show, Superman. So many of the popular characters were on the radio. So he grew up listening to it.
He was one of those we called George Lucas. That generation was not we're not referring to Ahsoka here, but the Fulcrum generation,
Mm-hmm.
because they were right on the ebb, right, where they were still in the one foot in the world of radio and one foot in the world of television, as that change was occurring. But I think he was interested in that challenge of doing the sound. What can you do Star Wars with just sound? And but he gave away the rights to Star Wars for $1, and then the rights to the music for $1 each episode. But the problem was the rights to the music would later on become an issue because the union stepped in at the time of Return of the Jedi and said, you can't do this. And so that's one of the reasons Return of the Jedi was delayed, was because the cost of licensing the music and paying all the musicians who had worked on it was prohibitive at that time.
So Lucasfilm didn't own the rights to the music. It was 20th Century Fox, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
Yes.
I
Yes.
see.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the book is in tribute to a very important person, and without him, the radio drama probably would not have been made. Tell me about Brian Daley and his invaluable contribution to Star Wars.
You want to say?
Yeah. They first were working with a different author, a different writer, someone from the BBC, and that person wasn't able to capture the spirit of Star Wars. And we tell the story in the book how Richard Toscan wrote, to show that this can be done, and he wrote a script. And it was Carol Titleman who suggested Brian Daley. Brian Daley was the lead writer for Del Rey. He had written the Doomsphere series, which was very popular. And then when Del Rey got the license for Star Wars, Brian Daley was the first person they thought of. And Brian Daley was one of us. He was a science fiction fan. He had seen Star Wars when it came out with his friend James, who went on to write. James Lucchino is a Star Wars author. And he clicked with the characters. He clicked with that world. And when Del Rey got the license for Star Wars, Brian Daley wrote the Han Solo series, and he was a very fast writer. He wrote that first Han Solo book in 6 weeks. Um, so Carol Titleman thought of him because of his ability to capture the spirit of Star Wars. And so Brian Daley, he wrote, I want to make sure I get it right, 6 months he wrote the 13 episodes. So it just shows again how fast of a writer he was. And he was very smart. This was a man who he served in Vietnam, and he was writing war reports. So he was using his writing abilities every day in the military. But when he got out of the military, he was a high school graduate, went to the military, came out of the military, and then was going to college. And when he sat for the SATs, this is 5 years after he's been in high school, and he gets a perfect score on the written portion and a near perfect score on the math. So this is a man very talented, very creative, and he was just the perfect fit to write this. And they really were in a bind. They needed to get someone who could write these scripts.
The problem was they had originally had the BBC as a partner. Because Frank had to convince NPR to do this. There were many people at NPR who thought this was the worst idea ever, either because of elitism and other, though Star Wars is popular culture, it's not, it's not a great highbrow piece of literature, or because they just thought it wasn't going to work. How could you do this? And in order to sort of assuage those fears, he brought in the BBC as a partner because they really knew how to do radio dramas and had been doing them for all those years. But the script writer that Mary Jo mentioned did a fine script, but that it felt more like Lord of the Rings than Star Wars, which is different, more fantasy, but it didn't have the cowboy kind of the Western feel of Star Wars, the samurai influence. I mean, there's so many influences in Star Wars, Wizard of Oz. I mean, there's so many influences in there. And it didn't have that spirit. So Richard Toscan wrote that spec script but not telling them who wrote it, because he wanted to show them, because they were going to pull the plug on it and say, well, see, we can't do this. If this BBC writer can't do it, nobody can can create these scripts. And he just did a spec script right away. They liked it. They wanted him to hire that writer. Then he had to reveal it was him who wrote it. And he didn't want to write it. So it really was Brian Daley who saved the day, because they were very close to shutting the project down.
And then Star Wars is a little over 2 hours long, but what Brian Daley had to do was expand it into a 6-hour radio drama. But where did he get the source material? Where did he come up with the storyline to fill in the gaps that the movie may not have had time to show you on the screen? Where is that source material coming from?
Well, George gave him some resources. He had the novelization by Alan Dean Foster, really, and then he had Splinter of the Mind's Eye. Of course, he had his own books to look at also, and he was given a series of interviews that were done. These are fascinating, by the way. They are reprinted if anybody is interested in J.W. Rinsler's wonderful Making of Star Wars book. And they were interviews that George gave like the summer Star Wars came out, in character. So George is Princess Leia, George is C-3PO, George is Han Solo, answering questions from the interviewer, who was Carol Titleman. And some of the details are fascinating because they wind up being in Phantom Menace and so on. Some things change, but other things stayed the same. In fact, Anakin is mentioned. The name Anakin is mentioned in there as their father. So it was kind of interesting to read those. But that's kind of what Brian could draw from, because obviously there was not a whole lot of source material at that time. There was not a lot of expanded universe.
And he really used his imagination, and surprisingly, there weren't any, from George Lucas, there weren't any real changes to make. There was one line. He has a line where Han Solo says, I'm just like I'm just driving the bus, or something about
Yeah, I'm
driving.
just the bus driver
Yeah,
or something.
yeah, and that was the only line they wanted changed, but there wasn't anything else that they said, you gotta remove this or add this, so, he was just really good at, um, just making backstory come to the forefront. So when C3PO and R2D2 can't go into the Moss Eisley cantina, so what are they up to? Well, he gets to write that. And so he's filling in those little corners, and then he's expanding, like you said, expanding the story. So um, in the Star Wars radio drama, those first two episodes are not in the film. So we get to find out, for example, like with Princess Leia, what was she doing leading up to Star Wars: A New Hope? Like in the those first few days, and I don't know if I don't know if it's spoiling it or not, but you find out how she learns about the Death Star. So that's the kind of, you get this extra backstory that really enhances your enjoyment of Star Wars.
And in that in Empire, he added a scene that's one of my favorites,
Oh
which
yeah.
is Han and Luke uh, in the shelter overnight. So you get to see what transpired between the two of them, because they aren't together a lot in that film. Really, I mean, once Vader invades, everybody's separated, and so it was a chance to get a little bit of that banter that we all enjoyed in the first film between those characters. And but yeah, it really was his imagination that created those. But I think he understood Star Wars so well. We interviewed James Lucchino about Brian, who he loved. They're almost really like brothers. And when they saw Star Wars and how it transformed Brian, it was what Brian had been waiting for really his whole life. I think a lot of us had that experience, and whenever we came into the franchise, it was probably life changing to some degree, or to a big degree. And so he really understood those characters. There were a lot of parallels between him and Han.
Hmm.
Um, you
Loving
know,
fast vehicles, kind of a
charming personality,
yeah.
kind of a roguish kind of quality to them, to him, loyalty, all those things that made Han Solo who he was. I mean, for us, we talk about this a lot. That there's sort of a triangle of who created Han Solo. Of course, at the very top is George Lucas, who created the everything that, the core of the character. But on one side of the triangle is Harrison Ford, of course, and the other side of the triangle is Brian Daley, because he was so important through his novels and through the radio dramas, laying the groundwork for who that character became. Of course, gotta give a little credit to Lawrence Kasdan too, but I think the a lot of there's so much about Han's backstory
Mhm.
that either became public knowledge because Brian brought it out of sort of the Lucasfilm archives or notes, or Brian created it himself. Including whole cloth scenes that will wind up in the films. Like, you can read one of his Han Solo books, and you'll see the Millennium Falcon's deflector dish get knocked off, and him having to turn sideways in order to get through a chasm, much like that occurred in Jedi and Empire, and so on, and him speaking about Han liking to shoot first,
Mhm.
20 years before had this dilemma, right? So lots of great things about Han, coming up with what the stripes meant on his pants.
Yeah, the Corellian stripes.
Yeah, just so he really understood Star Wars, I think. And Anthony Daniels
I was gonna
talks about
say,
that. Yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
he was very good at capturing C-3PO's, his unique kind of humor, and Brian Daley was instrumental in getting Anthony Daniels to return, especially to return for the Return of the Jedi radio drama that was, you know, done in '96, many years after the first two. And Anthony Daniels credits Brian Daley, saying, he really captures C-3PO's voice. And other than George Lucas, that's who he trusts to write C-3PO.
Yeah, when he was asked, "Would you return for Return of the Jedi and do C-3PO?" He said, "Is Brian writing it?" And they said yes, and he said, "Then I'll do it."
Hmm.
Yeah, I do want to come back. I know you touched on it, Maria, about some of the moments in the radio drama that's really is either not in the film or it's expanded for the radio drama. I do want to come back and talk about
Yes.
few of those parts of the radio drama, but I want to talk about the cast. Now,
Hmm.
the idea was they were going to bring the original actors from the film and have them play their characters in the radio drama. Unfortunately, not everyone was available, but we did get Mark Hamill and we got Anthony Daniels, at least for the first Star Wars film. Um, of the new actors portraying Han Solo, Princess Leia, Darth Vader, um, is there a particular performance that you enjoy, that you thought did a very good job displaying that character in the radio drama?
Oh, yes, so many. Brock Peters is Darth Vader. So if you're also a fan of Star Trek, you know him as Benjamin Sisko's father, Joseph Sisko. Um, he and Anthony Daniels were the two that recorded in a booth because their voices have to be augmented. Um, and he did a great job as Darth Vader. And Perry King is amazing as Han Solo. And for fans, he auditioned for the role of Han Solo. So you can go onto YouTube and you can watch his audition. Um, and then Anne Sachs as Leia. She loved that character. She describes it as a gift being able to play her.
Yeah, I mean, there's really not a bad one in the bunch. I think the Perry, our favorite story that Perry King told us was that we would ask him, like, well, Harrison Ford had Peter Mayhew next to him on stage, so he could look at Chewbacca, and although he's speaking to him in English, because Peter would speak English lines, back to them, so that they could have some sort of cadence with each other. He at least had that I don't want to say crutch, but that interplay. But Perry didn't have that. There was no Chewbacca standing next to him when he was doing Han Solo, and he said no, but he was there. He was in my mind. He goes, I talking to him. He goes, he's still my best friend. I still, so it was so real to him playing the role of Han Solo that he felt like Chewbacca was next to him, and speaking to him and having those interactions. And then I think Brock, one of the things that Brock has to be complimented for a lot is, Vader's a pretty silent character for the most. He doesn't have to say a whole lot because he doesn't need to. But in the radio dramas, he talks a lot, and he does such a great job at keeping him ominous and mysterious. Even though he's got a whole lot of, once you start having a lot of dialogue, then all your secrets are revealed. But he does a really great job, I think, with that. And that scene, Mary Jo will probably talk about it later, between Anne and Brock, and is an amazing scene. I think on Return of the Jedi, Josh Farden deserves a lot of credit, because stepping in to do Luke, Luke is carrying that radio drama. And here's a young actor who had never worked in radio before, coming in and doing it, and doing it close enough that you feel it's Luke. And Luke with the right voice, meaning the right timbre of a young man, but not. That's in fact Mark Hamill had spoke about that when he was doing Empire. He had done Empire. He had filmed Empire already when they were recording Star Wars radio drama, and so he had to find his original kind of like golly gee, kind of voice. And I think Josh deserves a lot of credit for stepping in. That's not an easy role. Of course, Anthony Daniels was of all of them the most experienced in radio dramas. He had done a lot of radio dramas long before Star Wars, so he was not only sort of the soul of Star Wars, and a mentor to a lot of the actors who had never worked in that medium before, but he was also the soul of radio dramas.
And you mentioned Josh Farden being young. David Allen Greer was also young. He was a student at the time, and he was used to making $25, acting as a student. And here on the radio dramas, he was making $700 a day. So it was a huge jump for him.
Yeardley Smith, Nia Vardalos.
Yes.
There's so many famous people who become very famous later on who worked on these radio dramas when they were students or just starting out in the business.
And John Lithgow is Yoda, but wasn't it Mark Hamill who wanted? He kind of did a little audition. He wanted to be Yoda.
Mark Hamill wanted to do Yoda, and did a very good Yoda, but John Madden was concerned. Would they be able to do that? How do you switch back? That would be an awful lot of editing for Tom Vagley, who is the wonderful editor on their producer and sound engineer. And so, luckily, John Madden, who directed these, who he would go on to win an Academy Award for Shakespeare in Love. And but he was began his career within radio, and he directed all three of these. And he had directed John Lithgow in a play. And Lithgow had young children who were watching the Muppets, and so he was doing like Fozzie Bear, and they were out to dinner, and he was doing these imitations, like talking about what his kids are watching, and he was doing, and he mentioned him about having to do Yoda, needing a Yoda, and he started to do Yoda, and he's like, "Will you do it?" And he said, "Sure, he'd do it." So it's a great story.
And you got Billy
Billy D came in for Empire. The original idea was to try to get as many of them as they could, and they did have Harrison Ford and Carrie Fisher. But Harrison wound up getting Raiders of the Lost Ark, couldn't do it. So Carrie didn't want to do it if Harrison wasn't doing it. And there's a great story in the book that Richard Toscan tells where he picks up Anthony Daniels at the airport, who thinks he's going to be reuniting with all of his friends because they were all supposed to do it. And it was him and Mark. And he was like, it was a little different experience than he was planning on.
They're all great performances. I agree with you. Brock Peters, for me, does stand out because of so much he had to do, as what you said, as far as, he had to tell, not show, because it's radio. So it's a lot of effort that he had to put into that scene between Darth Vader and Leia, which we will talk about. So Mark Hamill was available for Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back radio drama, but not available for Return to Jedi. And that's where I want to start. Whenever I watch Star Wars, I get so much, the first movie, I get so much more out of it. Every viewing that I have, I learn something. And how groundbreaking this movie is that you have your lead character not appear in the movie until maybe 20, 25 minutes into the film, which is wonderful. It's like you don't really see that happen. But in the radio drama, you're right. The story does not pick up where the movie starts. It actually begins further back on Tatooine, where Luke is hanging around with his friends on Tashi Station, like we know he does, being a teenager, and he's being teased about going into the Imperial Academy, like his friend Biggs. And then he gets a surprise, Biggs return. And I love this moment between Biggs and Luke, where Biggs confesses that actually he's no longer with the Academy, that he is joining the rebellion. And he's trying to talk Luke into just getting away from Tatooine and getting off this rock and doing something else. But, Luke is obligated to his uncle. Talk about that moment. When you first heard it on the radio. I don't know if you maybe read the book prior to or knew that moment was even existed on paper. But when you heard it in the radio, how'd you feel about the radio program starting on Tatooine rather than in space as the movie did?
That's your favorite, isn't it?
Yeah, I love Tatooine stuff. That's because it's that origin story for Luke that is what appeals to me. When he looks at the twin suns, I used to tell my students, that's every human being everywhere on the planet, right? That's the unifier of all humanity. We all look at the same. Well, you shouldn't look at the sun. You know what I mean? Don't look directly at the sun. But it's the same sun that's in the sky now is the same sun 5,000 years ago. It's the same sun everywhere across the planet. It's the same moon. It's when we're looking at these things, and it's our peek into the universe, and a lot of us will look at it and go, who am I? What am I supposed to do? Is this the job I'm supposed to have? That kind of thing. And it's just a wonderful moment with Luke in that. And this, I just love anything about Tatooine. So, I never got to, and this is true for all of us. We never got to see the big scene between him and Luke, until the Phantom Menace came out, and they released a CD that was a CD-ROM that had some deleted scenes on it. And that was around the late 1990s. That was the first time you could ever see that scene. And of course, you're looking at it on a whatever it was, not even an MP, whatever they were back then. I don't even know what they were. But I can't remember. Pixelated and everything, seen on your Star Wars CD-ROM. Then eventually it would get released onto the Blu-rays and things like that. So the only sort of knowledge we had of that scene was the image in the storybook, trading cards, and in the Marvel comics. But you could never hear it. You could never feel it. And it was just sort of like, as a kid, you were confused because I didn't see this in the film, and we didn't understand. I was 7 when the original Star Wars came out, so I was, wondering what this all meant. But when I heard it on the radio drama, that whole first chapter, they had me at hello, really, because that was all. It's all Tatooine. It's Luke and his friends. You get to know Fixer more. You get to know Cammy more. You get to see that really beautiful scene. Because would Luke have wanted to go out into the galaxy if it wasn't for Biggs? I don't know, because Biggs was, Big is what Han Solo became to him, the big brother figure. And when Biggs dies, Han Solo takes that mantle and, is his big brother figure. So, it is a really lovely scene. I love that. One of the great sorrows I have when we were researching the book was we were able to get Brian's original scripts. His widow was very generous, giving us all these resources and access to all of these things. We got to read Brian's droid scripts for the Droid animated show that never got made.
He wrote a lot.
He wrote a lot,
and 7 or 8 of them,
and tons of Star Wars ideas that he had generated that never went anywhere because they either weren't published or wasn't at Del Rey at the time and that kind of thing. But one of his original ideas for how to open Return of the Jedi script, was to have Luke back on Tatooine as he is, but he's on kind of a bridge, and Cammy and Fixer are going to go do a business deal with Jabba the Hutt, which is never a wise thing. So Luke kind of makes himself in such a way that he's kind of doing like Yoda would do. He's kind of playing like a character and telling him, you can't cross the bridge. You can't, and Fixer winds up turning around and leaving and going back home because of this crazy guy who's in front of him. And then Cammy comes up to him and says, Luke, right? You're Luke. And he's like, thank you, Luke, because she knew that him going there would have been a bad idea, that he could have wound up in a rancor pit or something. He wasn't the greatest boss, Jabba the Hutt. And so that was, I thought, a really wonderful scene, because it's Campbellian and mythological, and the hero returns home and he's unrecognizable by the people who he grew up with. And I just thought that was a wonderful scene, but for budgetary reasons, they'd have to pay a Fixer, they'd have to pay Cammy. They edited that from the screenplay, or from the radio play, I should say.
Return of the Jedi is much shorter than the previous radio dramas.
Yeah, so episode 1 opens up on Tatooine. Now episode 2 opens up on Alderaan. This was truly amazing, and so I'm listening to this again, and there's a story about Leia, and she's having a meeting with her father, which he's unnamed. We don't know who he is at the time. I guess they didn't have a name at the time. And Leia is telling her father what she's witnessed the empire doing in terms of torturing innocent people, creating interrogation centers, taking lives without cause, and she's asking Alderaan to get involved in this war. Now, Alderaan is a world of peace, but she's trying to convince her father that we can't let this happen. We can't let the empire get away with this, and Alderaan has to do more. Talk about that scene. That moment with Leia and her father? How'd you feel about that scene?
Yeah, that one's my favorite
Yeah.
of the episodes. So yeah, we learn more about Alderaan, and Leia learns the code word Death Star, and Lord Tyon, who is under Tarkin, he comes over to the Organa's house for dinner, and he's under the impression that Leia might be, interested in being his wife, and he's trying to impress upon her, what the empire can do, and you know, he's. I get the impression when I read the script, that he's trying to brag to her, like, you think I'm under Tarkin and I'm just this like lowly guy in the empire, but I'm working on this big project, and we got this, um, he's not going to use the word Death Star, but he's describing, this machine,
Battle
and it's
battle
the size of
station.
a planet.
Yeah,
And
right.
so during this conversation, Leia uses the code words Death Star, and he's like, "How do you know that? Nobody knows that." And he's like, "Okay, I got to question you and your father." And then there's a struggle because he's like suspicious of both of them. He ends up dead. So you get the idea that there's a struggle, and either it's he's armed on Organa, or on Alderaan, they're not armed, and he's having dinner, and there's no guards there. Um, so either he ends up shooting himself with his own blaster, or Leia. It's kind of left ambiguous there. But you really see her. You get to see like her passion, her feistiness. This very animated discussion with Lord Tyon, and it's great. It gives you again like what she's doing before A New Hope begins.
And I think what's important about what Mary Jo said was that this is really the only time we got to see Leia as a senator or a
Hmm.
diplomat, or uh, you know someone who's able to deal with these sort of powerful people, because of where Star Wars starts out. So we always call that chapter the original Rogue One, because it's
Yeah.
sort of the where did that how did these things fall into Leia's hands, these plans and so on.
Yeah. And what works in that moment, or that chapter, is hearing Princess Leia's theme, in the background, so it just tells you how important music is for
Mhm.
this radio drama, and they needed to have John Williams music to make it work. And I thought it was just beautiful, just the performances and the sound effects and the music all came together brilliantly. It was wonderful.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it, how it all comes together. And because you're imagining it, so you, the listener, you're the director because you're picturing in your mind the characters and where they are. And especially a scene like this where we're not seeing it, we haven't seen this on screen. So you're picturing her, and then you get to decide, what is she wearing, what's on the table. So you're the director. And because you're creating all that in your mind, you're more likely to remember it. So people who have listened to the radio dramas, it stays with them because they've created so much of it. So it's really good at it's just sticking with you.
And that's Tom vaguely deserves a lot of credit for that. It's Tom who's deciding where music is being placed, sound
Hmm.
effects. I mean, he spent more. They recorded very quickly over a course of less than a few weeks. But Tom, it took him months and months to assemble all of that into what it became. So he was very, very important to that project.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's move on to probably the most talked about moment in the Star Wars radio drama, and that has to be the torture scene.
Mhm.
Um, Now, it's funny because when I was the first time I heard it, I was um, maybe 11 or 12 on NPR, on a local NPR station in New York City. And I don't remember this torture scene. I guess it's because it was way over my head. It wasn't something that I paid attention to. But now that I listen to it, I actually listened to the radio drama twice before talking to you both, and I was just amazed as to what they got away
Mhm.
with the torture scene. Now, of course, in the movie, you don't really see anything. You just see this droid coming in with this long needle, and the blast door closes, and it is a PG movie, so you can't go any further than that. But in the radio drama, I mean, it really goes into details as to this torture and how Vader's describing the level of pain that Leia is feeling, and Anne Sachs' performance and her agonizing, and how much this is hurting her, and Vader's relentless, and he's like, more, more, you're feeling this, and this is what your heart's going to do. It's going to stop soon, until he puts a complete stop to it. But what do you think of this torture scene? I don't. Do you remember hearing this? I don't know how old you were the first time you listened to this radio drama, but when you listened to it the first time, do you remember this torture scene? And now that you're an adult, what do you think of it now?
Well, I had the same, probably the very similar experience as you did, which was uh, I didn't register it as a kid. I listened on WBEZ in Chicago to it, but I either or I think when you're a kid, maybe you know you're a little more interested in those kind of horror movies, things like that. Like that kind of stuff doesn't affect you as much, I guess. But yeah, when you hear it as an adult, it's and you appreciate the acting behind it. I think um, you have a really, I think, different reaction to it. It's tough. It's tough to listen to, and also it's fascinating to listen to because there's so much where there's just little hints of it. You're like, well, Brian didn't know that Leia was. He knew when he was writing that Vader was Luke's father. He knew before. He was one of the very few people who knew. He was told that by Lucasfilm because they didn't want him to write anything about Luke's father in the radio dramas. So he knew and had to keep that a secret. Um, and he knew before Mark Hamill knew. Really, he knew. He was one of the very small circle of people who knew. And so they he had to sort of downplay that, not do anything with that, and there. But he didn't know that Leia was also Vader's daughter. And so there's a few parts in there where he's like, she's calling out for her father, and he's talking to her, and it gets awfully close to him being like, "I'm your father." I mean, it comes very close to that, and so it's kind of fascinating. But did you want to say anything?
Yeah, that when you were talking about how intense that scene was, that was the only um, scene. It was the only episode that they got a negative letter from. So there were people who thought, "Wow, this did go very far." Um, my favorite story when we were interviewing Anne Sachs, her son Sam was sitting next to her, and it kind of felt like they were having talking about the role in that scene, and Sam shares with his mother for the first time. She does not know this story, so it was kind of like we felt like we were eavesdropping on this private conversation where the son Samuel, he's a little kid. They're going on a family vacation, and he's in the back seat. He's listening to the radio drama, and he listens to the torture scene, and it has a real effect on him. And he doesn't exactly remember how old he is, but you can picture an elementary school kid listening to this, and this is his mother he's hearing. So it's the character Leia, but it's his mother, it's her voice. And so he talked about how that really affected him. And she's hearing that for the first time, and she didn't know um, how big of a fan he was of Star Wars, and also how that scene affected him to hear his mother being tortured.
Yeah.
And so it was beautiful just watching that. And Anne was talking about how she didn't. It's not like an actor who's in a theater who is going to read the lines over and over, do a lot of rehearsal. Anne preferred to go into this cold to give a real, like, first genuine reaction, and that's how she played it. So um, it wasn't like they rehearsed a lot for that. And also because of the time that
Yeah, they
they
didn't have
didn't
a
have a
lot of
lot of
time.
time. They didn't have the studio for that long. But yeah, she's given a mind control drug. She's having hallucinations. She's confused.
It was
It's a
funny.
strong
It
scene.
reminded me a little bit. Anne's comments reminded me a little bit what Carrie Fisher had said. How it was very difficult to be mean to
Hmm.
Peter Cushing because he was such a lovely man, and
He
he's wearing
smelled like
he
lavender.
smells like lavender, and he wears slippers on the stage, and it was very hard to be angry at him.
Hmm.
And she felt that way about Brock Peters, that he was such a
Yeah.
just wonderful man and sweet and kind, and the two of them had to do this play together like that. And so afterwards he came
Mm.
over and like
They
hugged
hugged,
her, they
yeah.
hugged each other, and
I thought that was really sweet.
that
Yeah.
was really nice to hear that they were able to create that without any you know without months of rehearsal. Is
Hmm.
It was quite astounding,
Yeah.
but frightening. It's
It
definitely,
is.
if you have little kids and you're listening to this, you may want to preview that chapter first,
Yeah.
and maybe do a little bit of a fast forward on that portion, because it's pretty intense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. It was groundbreaking for Star Wars back then. Yeah. Uh, After 13 days of recording and sound mixing and editing at a cost of about 250,000, promotion began for the Star Wars radio drama, and then it premiered on March 1st, 1981. What was the
Right.
audience reaction when they heard the radio drama for the first time?
It was huge. They got 55,000 calls, and they were only capable of answering 12,000 of them. They got 10,000 letters, and most of them were from first-time listeners. So they really struck gold by choosing Star Wars to do, and it boosted NPR's reputation, people knowing about it. They had 135% increase in radio, 40% increase in listeners, and 135% for radio dramas. So, um, huge boost to NPR. Really, you know, um, Star Wars saved NPR.
Yeah, Frank Minkowitz said that if it wasn't for Star Wars, NPR would not have had the funding to survive that year. That it was because of Star Wars. It also allowed them to show they had just created new. They were the first. NPR was the first radio network to have satellite technology, and that was the so common to us today, but back then it was a groundbreaking, and it gave them a chance to showcase that new technology, that they were the first to have it. Um, and of course, then ad nauseum, it would be replayed over and over again. In fact, there were a few networks few affiliates that refused to play it the first time, but there were none that refused to play it the second airing because they knew what it meant. It really did help in terms of the ratings, and also the publicity for it was in Time magazine. It was in many local papers. One of the things we did was wade through. Brian was very good at keeping clippings of mentions of his books or his Star Wars work, and so there was wading through that, and also internet archives of newspapers, thousands of them mentioning the radio dramas, and people writing in and talking about them. My favorite letter is from a man who talks about how he was out in his field, a farmer, listening to the radio dramas, and then he looks up and his cows are there and they're listening to the radio dramas along with him. And I mean, that's kind of priceless for NPR because they were looking for ways to get people to know what NPR was and what kind of programming they had. And, very quickly after that, in tandem, the BBC had done Hitchhiker's Guide. And so they were playing that. And then all of a sudden, radio dramas were something that were not foreign anymore to people. And it really, I think, was transformative, but it was a huge, huge success.
So, due to the success of Star Wars, NPR announced in 1982 that there would be a radio adaptation of The Empire Strikes Back. All episodes written by Brian Daley, all the principal cast from the first radio drama return, including Billy D. Williams, as we talked about. And that sequel to the radio drama premiered on Valentine's Day in 1983. And then 13 years later, Return to Jedi also premiered, all episodes again written by Brian Daley. But by the time Daley got official word that they were going to move ahead with the Return of the Jedi drama, he received some devastating news. Can you talk about that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, Brian was very excited to do Return of the Jedi. He thought they were going to do it right away, and he actually wrote some lines down, including the very last line. He had an idea for the very last line of the radio dramas. He wanted it to be a line by Luke because Luke always had the last word in the radio dramas for him. And so, but because of NPR funding issues and other exigencies, it got delayed until CDs and audiobooks became a thing. And but by that time, he had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and he kind of kept it initially close to the vest. He didn't let them know until he met up with them. They all got together just to sort of be reunited and start talking about the plans for it and what to do with it. And Brian was a big guy. He was a strong, almost everyone we talked to said the same thing. His cousin James Lucchino, his widow Lucia St. Clair Robeson, how he could have been an actor. He was really good looking, big, had a presence to him. But when they saw him, they knew something was wrong because he was thin and had gone through quite a bit already with that cancer. So, but he worked despite the cancer. It was very important to him to finish that radio drama. The sad thing is he wasn't able to be there for the recording, at least not physically. He had been at the recordings for Star Wars and Empire while they were actually recording the lines, one to help write any new lines that needed to be written, and also to write what are called wild lines, which are these sort of sidelines for people. He wanted to write the wild lines because he didn't want, as he used to joke around,
Yeah.
he didn't want somebody
Like the extras.
an extra saying, well, my ugnaught will see your ugnaught, and he didn't want these kind of goofy lines. He wanted it to be realistic, real military chatter, things like that. So he wrote all those background lines that usually the screenwriter doesn't write. And
he also had to be on the recording set because he had to edit C-3PO's dialogue because droids don't breathe. And so if a line was too long and Anthony Daniels has to take a breath, Brian had to be there to shorten that dialogue.
So, but he wasn't able to be there for Return of the Jedi, except for in spirit and in strong spirit. Anthony Daniels told us that they spent. There were many moments where they were talking about Brian or laughing about Brian and thinking about Brian. And so they even, on the day they finished recording, which was February 10th, 1996, they recorded a special message for Brian. They were going to be like, "Hey, Brian, we finished and we miss you." And so they had some of the actors wrote their own dialogue. So Anthony Daniels did his own, and it was supposed to be in character at the start. And you have Anthony, C-3PO talking about how they miss Master Brian and all that kind of stuff. And then, and sometimes it was written by, either John Madden or Tom Vagley, but, like for Josh Farden, who didn't really know Brian, except through the words on the paper. So they all record these kind of funny little tribute to Brian. And as soon as Tom Vagley had, recorded it, he called Lucia to say that they were finished, and she told him that he was not going to make it that day, that probably longer than another day or so. And devastated. And in fact, they were all at a wrap party at a restaurant when they got the word that he had passed away. The thought of really everyone who knew him was that he held on to make certain a couple things happened, that Lucia would be taken care of, that the radio dramas, that he was able to complete Return of the Jedi, and that they were able to finish recording. And I think Anthony Daniels says it best, that Brian had a great sense of timing in such a sad way. Mm-hmm. That it was such a profound loss, and so
they did play the tribute. They played it at his memorial service.
So they did get to hear, and you can hear it if you have some of the longer edition CD copies of it. They do have that tribute on there.
Can I ask you both your Star Wars story? Maria, how were you introduced to Star Wars?
Well, the first one that I saw was in '83, so I saw Return of the Jedi, and I loved all the aliens, all the like Jabba's, all the creatures, the Pita Carcoon, and of course Yoda is my favorite. So that was the one I really latched onto. So I saw that, and then as I was got older, then I saw the other two. But Return of the Jedi was my entry into Star Wars.
And I was the typical, stereotypical. I was the kid that he made it for, right? I was 8 years old when Star Wars came out. Saw it at the theater. The couple days after it had opened in Chicago, stood in the long lines to see it. Went to school, got the comics. It was my childhood was transformed by that experience. I had always liked science fiction. I loved Planet of the Apes. I got into teaching because of Welcome Back, Kotter, but I was a big, Happy Days. That was kind of my world, but I also liked science fiction a lot. And I don't know if I understood the messages that were in Planet of the Apes, because there were so many, about nuclear war, about the environment, about race, about religion. I mean, there were so many. It was filled with a million great messages for us, warnings for us. I like the apes. That was really cool that they talked. But later on, I hopefully began to appreciate that. And I like Star Trek and things like that. When Star Wars came along, those other franchises had existed before I was born. I was alive when Star Trek was wrapping up its original run, but I was too young to watch it. And Planet of the Apes, of course, was a little bit before I was, too with it. So Star Wars was that first franchise, that first science fiction franchise where it was born, and I was there from the start. And boy, what a start that was. It was such an incredible time. Very difficult to explain to people today who weren't there, because it was such a unique cultural, it really was, I always call it a meteor strike. I mean, it really was it just came out of nowhere, and it was everywhere. And I mean, everywhere. And everyone knew about it, whether you were 100 years old or, 1 years old, you were hearing the music, you were seeing this, and it was so universal and cultural and amazing. So
our students are amazed when you tell them it was in the theater for a year.
Yeah,
it doesn't happen.
That I couldn't get the toys until the following March. That we suffered with puzzles and board games. That's all we had. T-shirts and and that you couldn't. I listened to Roscoe Lee Brown. Every time I see Roscoe Lee Brown on a show, I can't not think of him narrating the Star Wars story album, because that was the only way to relive the film. And I listened to that thing 5,000 times on my tape recorder and my record player. So yeah, it's been a huge part of my life, and I married Joe's. And when we were married, we walked in ourselves to the Star Trek Voyager theme, but we had our family walk into the throne room scene music from Star Wars. And it's our son's middle initial is S, and it does stand for Star Wars, Star Trek, Superman, Sociology, Shatner, all the great things in life that start with S.
That's incredible. That's a beautiful story. I love that. Thank you. And John, you used to teach a sociology class on Star Wars. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Why did you want to teach something like that?
Well, I part of it comes back from what I was talking about with Planet of the Apes, that I always saw. Well, I didn't say all I saw. I When I was introduced to sociology, it was an epiphany to me that science fiction was doing the same exact thing that sociology does.
Yeah.
It was just doing it in a literary form versus, say, a science form. But they were both taking what was going on today, extrapolating it into the future, wondering what trends were there, trying to understand the past through whatever lens that they were using. And so that really excited me when I was in graduate school. And so I did a lot of my graduate work was on popular culture, science fiction, and sociological messages within that. And so um, I wanted to get students excited about it, and I figured, well, let's take something that they know, like Star Wars, and then from there say how is sociology and Star Wars together. And so what was interesting is I wound up with two kinds of students. I wound up with students who knew a lot about Star Wars and nothing about sociology, but I also wound up with students who knew a lot about sociology and nothing about Star Wars. And I was wondering, why are you taking this class? But they were interested in understanding popular culture, understanding what Star Wars was. The class I did came out at the time that Attack of the Clones was coming out, and Revenge of the Sith. I kind of taught it during that period of time. So Star Wars was very much on people's minds, of course, at that time.
Yeah. Well, this has been an incredible honor to have you on our podcast. I am so glad to know you. I am a fan of your work, and I know that you're also a big Star Trek fan. And it would be wonderful. I know we have a big anniversary coming up for Star Trek. That maybe we can get together again and talk about Star Trek the next time. That would be
That
awesome. Yeah,
I
yeah,
love it.
yeah.
That would be great. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. Where can people find you?
Well, we're on Facebook. We share an account. We usually put up things about the books or things like that. Sometimes just fan stuff. But so we're on Facebook. If they just look up my name, John Tenuto, but it's really our shared account. And that's probably the best way to get us. We're also on Twitter, but we don't really do much on Twitter. Just because I figured so Facebook's enough for me. I don't want to spend my whole day looking at a whole bunch of different social media sites. But we can certainly message if people follow us, and we would be happy to message through there and talk. We love talking with fellow fans. So would love to hear from people.
Wonderful, wonderful. Right. Thank you so much. This is the author of the Star Wars radio drama, Brian Daley and the Serialization That Saved NPR, Maria Jose Tunito and John Tunito. Tunito, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If it's okay, I want to share one thing with you.
Sure.
I just thought people would like to see this. So two things. By the way, if you love the radio dramas, make sure you listen to this. If you haven't, I don't know if it's backwards or not, but it's called The Rebel Mission to Ord Mantell. You can get it on record or tape. And Brian did write this. So
Oh,
it's
wow.
what happened to it's what happened to Han Solo on Ord Mantell that he mentions in Empire Strikes Back. So
Yeah.
it's kind of like episode 0 of the radio dramas. Now the actors are different, but it's written very much in the same style and it's the same length and so on as an episode of the radio drama. So it's definitely worth picking up and checking that out. And then I just want to share, this is something we both treasure a great deal. Lucia, who was Brian's widow, gave us these. So these were actually in Brian. These are Brian's books, not just written by Brian. These were the ones Brian owned.
Mm,
So she gave them to us for safekeeping and to have because she knows how much we love Brian.
wow.
And they are she inscribed them to us on behalf of Brian, and said that
Wow.
Brian would want us to have these. But if people are fans of the radio dramas, these are a wonderful way to listen to them. So you listen to radio
Yeah.
drama, and you can read along with Brian's scripts, and sometimes you'll see little differences. So you'll see what
Yeah.
Brian originally wrote,
Uh-huh.
and maybe a line had to be changed or
Shorten.
shortened or something like that, and so you're getting that experience. So it's definitely worth checking them out. I'm sure you can still find them on eBay or something like that, some auction site or some used bookstore or something. But definitely worth picking up. They're all Brian scripts, and they all have, one has a foreword by Brian, and two have a foreword by or two are by Brian, or yeah, I'm trying to see here. Yeah, Brian does the introductions, I think, to two of them, and Anthony Daniels does the introduction to Return of the Jedi because Brian had passed away by then. So those are some
Okay.
great resources if fans love the radio dramas.
Great. So eBay is where I could find those, along with
Yeah,
Orbentel. Okay.
yeah. One of the reasons we wrote the book is we were hoping that it might draw more attention to the radio dramas because
Mm.
they used to be available on things like Audible. You could download them, legally. I mean, certainly you could find them on YouTube. There's
Yes.
ways to find it, but we were, one of our big hopes is that Disney says, let's put this on Disney Plus and even animate them or give you visuals that go along with it. It would be a wonderful 50th anniversary. This is just an idea if anybody from Disney's listening.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because we really would, and it's a great way to celebrate the 50th anniversary too for next year. And thanks for all you're doing, by the way. Star Wars is generational. That was one of the themes of my class too, was the concept of how these things that last and matter are usually passed from parents to children, sometimes from children to parents, right? That sometimes happens,
Mhm.
as we know, right? We get taught about, new trends and new words and things.
So it's
Um,
beautiful to see you and your son
yeah,
talk.
it really is. It's such a great thing because if Star Wars is going to endure, it needs another generation, the next generation, to be interested in it.
Mhm.
And a lot of times the best feelings we all get from Star Wars are seeing it with family, seeing memories of our parents. My parents are both gone, and Mary Jo's father's gone, and those are memories you have of seeing the films with them, so buying an empty seat. I saw a few people doing that, which I thought was remarkable when Force Awakens came out. And people were buying an extra seat to keep an empty seat next to them for their parents that had passed away. I thought it was fantastic. So I think the most beautiful thing about Star Wars is its generational quality. So
Yeah.
thank you for doing
Yeah.
what you and your son are doing.
Thank you so much for that. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. So once again, Maria Jose Tenuto and John Tenuto, here's your book. All right. The Star Wars radio drama, Father Son Galaxy. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, but that is our episode for today. Thank you so much for watching or listening. Until next time, take care, and we will see you again.